Good evening to tonight's event. My name is Cordula van Weyer. I'm a professor at the History of Art department here at the University of York. I will be chairing this event tonight, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Before I introduce you to our speaker, Jean Strouse, who is joining us tonight from the US, I just need to run through some few technical notes, so please bear with me. Subtitles are available in this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Show Caption button at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching this event live, you can ask questions using the question and answer button on your screen. And this is available throughout the event. So questions can be posted at any time, and we will read some of them out in the second part of the event tonight for Jean to answer. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch it again on the York Festival of Ideas YouTube channel. So now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker this evening, Jean Strouse. Jean Strouse is an award-winning author and biographer who is well known for her book Morgan, American Financier, and Alice James, a biography. The latter won the Bancroft Prize in American History and Diplomacy. And she's also well known for her essays and reviews that have appeared in the New Yorker, New York Review of Books, the New York Times, Architectural Digest, Newsweek, and elsewhere. Jean has been a fellow of the MacArthur Foundation and served as the Sannen and John Weinberg director of the Dorothy and Lewis Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. So this evening, I'm going to be talking to Jean about her new research on the portraits of the Wertheimer family by expat US painter John Singer Sargent, and her book entitled Family Romance, John Singer Sargent and the Wertheimers, which was published, oh sorry, my screen is blurring it out, it was published in the US and the UK last autumn. So a warm welcome to you, Jean. Thank you for giving us your time to talk about this fantastic subject, which you unearthed and in so many ways. So I would invite you now to give us perhaps a setting the scene presentation before we then open to a conversation about the Wertheimers.
Thank you very much, Cordula, and thanks to the festival, the York Festival, for hosting this event. I'm really delighted to be speaking with all of you tonight, though in New York it's only afternoon. So let me move us to the first slide. John Singer Sargent painted this portrait of Ina and Betty, daughters of Asher and Mrs. Wertheimer, in 1901. He posed them in the drawing room of the family's house on Connaught Place in London. Asher, their father, was an eminent art dealer who filled the house with examples of his stock in trade, old master paintings and fine objects of decorative arts. You can see the frames of paintings on the wall behind the sisters, and the elder one, Ina, short for Helena, rests her left hand on the lid of a large Chinese vase. With her right arm around the waist of her sister, she seems to be presenting Betty to the world like a doll. Sargent's technical virtuosity and sense of play are in full effect here, as he extends the long line of Betty's turned-out right arm with the downstroke of her open fan. It's quite a trick here, and he's showing off a bit. A medical student at the time responded to public skepticism about this limb by photographing 20 arms and proving Betty's to be anatomically correct. People thought there was no arm that was as long as that. While Sargent was finishing this painting in his London studio on Tite Street, he showed it to a visiting American and asked, "What do you think of it?" What he himself thought came through in his questions as he went on a couple of minutes later. "Isn't it stunning of the taller girl? Don't you think she is handsome? And a few minutes after that, isn't Miss Wertheimer beautiful? She was indeed beautiful. 6 feet tall with luxuriant dark hair and a voluptuous figure. She was 23 when Sargent entered the Wertheimer family circle. He was 41. They remained such close friends over the following decades that Ina's husband wondered whether they had been lovers. We might come back to that in a few minutes. Here is a Sargent self-portrait. Although he was admired for his, quote, sensory revelation of character and for dragging the truth out of a man's superficial personality, he had zero interest in doing that for himself. He did just 3 self-portraits in oil, all on commission, and he looks guarded and remote in them all. The eyes open no window on the soul. This one, as you can see in the caption, was done for the Vasari corridor of artists' self-portraits in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. An expatriate American living in London, Sargent was the leading portrait artist of transatlantic high society by 1900. His parents had traveled from Philadelphia to Europe in the early 1850s to cheer up Mrs. Sargent after the death of their first baby, and they stayed abroad for the rest of their lives. John was born in Florence in 1856. His grandmother, who was traveling with them, called him Fra Giovanni. As a boy, he proved to be a gifted musician as well as an immensely talented artist. The Sargents had 2 more children, both girls, and traveled constantly throughout Europe. John became fluent in French and Italian, spoke some Spanish and German, and did not set foot in America until he was 20. The whole family moved to Paris in 1874 so that he could study in what was then the art capital of the world. There's a wonderful exhibition right now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York on Sargent and Paris, and it's going in September to the Musée d'Orsay in France. So if any of you has a chance to go see it in Paris, I would highly recommend it. In Paris, he inhaled the lessons of his teachers, immersed himself in the work of great predecessors, among them Velázquez and Frans Hals, Manet and Ingres, and he quickly gained recognition. One of his paintings was selected for the prestigious Paris Salon in 1877, and he showed work there every spring for the next 10 years. However, in 1884, his portrait of another American in Paris, Madame X, set off a hot scandal. I'm not going to say much about that right now, but if anyone wants to talk about it more in the question period, we certainly can. In the aftermath of that scandal, sorry, let me go back to Madame X, demand for Sargent's work dried up so completely that he thought of giving up painting and going into music or business. His friends Henry James and James McNeill Whistler urged him to move to England, eventually, which he slowly did, taking over Whistler's former studio in Chelsea, eventually buying it and the house next door, and staying for the rest of his life. Still, he was something of a nomad, always eager to get out of the studio, travel, and paint in North Africa, the Middle East, throughout Europe, and the US. One of his biographers said he was at home everywhere and belonged nowhere. As late as 1894, he said he was only vaguely living in London. Henry James, also an American expatriate living in England, proved enormously instrumental in Sargent's recovery from the Madame X disaster. He introduced the artist to potential American patrons and wrote a lavish appreciation of his work in Harper's New Monthly magazine, saying among other things that the early paintings offered the slightly uncanny spectacle of, I'm going back to Sargent, of a talent which on the very threshold of its career has nothing more to learn. When 2 superb portraits of British women were exhibited in London in the early 1890s, one of Sargent's friends wrote, "London is at his feet. There are no 2 opinions this year. He has had a cracking success." A few months later, the artist was elected to the Royal Academy, the British equivalent to the French Salon. Still, he always considered himself American. After his Royal Academy induction, he told Whistler, "As to the question of my nationality, I have not been invited to retouch it, and I keep my twang. If you should hear of anything to the contrary, please state that there was no such transaction and that I am an American. He turned down the offer of a knighthood in 1907, since it would have required him to give up his US citizenship. About that twang, I tried very hard to find recordings of Sargent's voice or video of his moving and walking around. I couldn't find either one. It was too early. So I expect he spoke a sort of a British English, kind of what we would now call Connecticut British, but I don't know. We also don't know how or exactly when Sargent met Asher Wertheimer, although he may have frequented the dealer's gallery in New Bond Street. Asher's father, Samson, had emigrated to England from Bavaria in 1839 to escape the severe restrictions placed on Jews by the German states. He was a gifted artisan in bronze who quickly rose to become one of England's leading art dealers. His clients included Rothschilds and members of the royal family, as did Sargent's clients. Samson Wertheimer left a substantial fortune when he died in 1892, about 386,000 pounds, which would be about 50 million pounds today. Both of his sons, Asher and Charles, followed Samson into the art trade and did even better. Here is Asher by Sargent. So Asher was an expert in old master paintings, and he commissioned the new master to do portraits of himself and his wife in 1897 for their 25th wedding anniversary. On seeing this one of Asher at the Royal Academy in 1898, one critic compared it to a Rembrandt. Another said, "Happy is the man whose portrait has been painted thus." Not all the responses were so positive, and we'll get into that in a bit. Sargent then went on to paint all 10 of the Wertheimer children, singly and in groups. This huge commission made Asher his greatest private patron. Working on the series for a decade between 1897 and 1908, the artist mock complained to a friend of being in a state of, quote, chronic Wertheimerism. So we will stop there for the moment and just continue our conversation.
You have written a really fascinating. You have written fascinating biographies of J.P. Morgan, Alice James, as I mentioned in the introduction. So John Singer Sargent is unusual for you. How did you discover him?
Well, he all my books are quite different from each other. So Sargent actually has sort of a walk-on part in each of the others. All three were Americans who spent a great deal of time in England and in Europe, the Jameses, Morgan, and Sargent. And so I knew Sargent a bit from that period and from his interactions with the James family and with Morgan. But I didn't know very much about his life. And in my book about Morgan came out in 1999. I was doing some work in Seattle in 2000, 2001, and there was an exhibition at the Seattle Art Museum of Sargent paintings, which I went to see just because I was interested in him. And it turned out it was an exhibition of these 12 portraits, the Wertheimers. It had been organized by the Jewish Museum in New York, but I hadn't seen it in New York. So I was quite surprised to find, I was very happy to find Sargent in Seattle and surprised to meet the Wertheimers. And from all 12 of the portraits were there, plus photographs from the family's descendants and wall text that indicated that they had become quite good friends for the rest of everybody's lives. And I was intrigued because I thought of Sargent as painting British aristocrats and American Boston Brahmins, but not Jews. And here was a family, a large family of Jewish people. And clearly it was more than just a professional relationship. It was a real friendship. So I had a million questions, but I wasn't looking to write a new book because I had just published one. I bought the catalog. I came back to New York. I took a very demanding full-time job, but it didn't leave me the questions about this series and the artist. And about 10 years later, I sort of got in touch with descendants of the Wertheimer family and found one big problem seemed to be, and we might talk about this more, there was very little documentary evidence about the Wertheimer family. You say Wertheimer, which is right. I mean, it was a German name. I have been saying Wertheimer, but both are correct. the records of the family art dealing firm had been apparently destroyed, and there was no thick archive. But thanks to these descendants who were just incredibly generous and, of course, interested in learning more themselves about their past, I did find a lot of documentary material. Not enough, not compared to J.P. Morgan and the James family, but enough to sort of flesh out the story.
Thank you. I mean, I mean, researching an entire family has a real complexity about it, and but there's also this additional complexity of reading Sargent's handwriting, which you narrated in your book so wonderfully.
Yeah.
And because he was also an avid letter writer, especially with Ina. Could you tell us about this story?
Yes, thank you. Sargent did, unlike the Wertheimers, Sargent did. I mean, they probably wrote a lot of letters, but the letters didn't survive. But he did. He wrote letters and notes and invitations, and I got access to a lot of his letters. And I liked him when I started. I really fell for him when I read his letters, his correspondence, because he's completely charming, witty, and an incredibly wonderful friend to the Wertheimers and to many other people, including many painters who were not nearly as talented as he was, but he was very generous with promoting them. I learned early on in my looking into all of this that there had been a packet of letters from Sargent to Ina that she had kept, and when she died too early in 1936, her husband found them, and he couldn't read them. His handwriting is absolutely impossible. It took me ages to learn how to make it out. It's like learning a new language. You just keep doing it and doing it and doing it until you finally begin to get it. Also, the two principal Sargent experts, Richard Ormond, who is his great nephew, and his colleague Elaine Kilmurray, were extremely helpful to me. And so when I got to a passage that I couldn't read, I would send it to them. Sargent wrote a fair amount in French, which I absolutely couldn't make out, but Elaine can, so I'm indebted to them in many, many ways. So I had learned slowly how to read the writing, but Ina's husband absolutely could not. So he gave the packet of letters to his daughter, their oldest daughter, Diana, and asked her if she could read them, and she couldn't. And then he said, well, he should take them to her Aunt Betty, the other person in that first painting that we saw, and see if she could read them. And also he said, do you think Mummy had an affair with Sargent? And so Diana took the letters to her Aunt Betty, who also couldn't read them, and asked her about an affair between Sargent and her mother. And apparently Betty said, oh, darling, don't be silly. Everyone knew he was only interested in Venetian gondoliers. So Sargent, there's no evidence of Sargent having a sexual relationship with anyone, male or female. Certainly, I would say, and many other people have said, that his inclinations were, his sexual interest was directed to men. There were wonderful sketches and paintings of nude men, most of which were not shown during his lifetime, but they exist and they're now being seen at museums. And very, very few of nude women, which has, of course, traditionally been the subject in the history of art. And his friendships were close. He was very close friends with many women, and also was part of a rather gay circle in New York of artists and writers. So I think that's probably accurate, although I would doubt that there were gondoliers. But there are two versions of that story in the Wertheimer mythology, anyway, that someone asked the mother, Mrs. Wertheimer, if she wasn't worried about her children spending so much time with Sargent. And she said the same thing. Oh, no, we knew he was only interested in Venetian gondoliers. Whether or not that's true, whether or not he was, I think it indicates the tolerant attitude the family would have taken to this question, and further underlines the comfort he would have felt in their presence. I think they were, in many ways, different kinds of outsiders, a family of German-descended Jews in London, very successful, never going to be one of us in aristocratic Britain, and an American expatriate a nomad, incredibly talented, being asked to paint aristocrats as well as nouveau riche people. And he painted a great many things that were not society portraits, but what he was known for was those. And then he too was never going to be one of us in British society. So I think there's an outsiderness.
You mention in your book that Sargent was known in some London circles as, I quote, a painter of Jews. Are we justified in categorizing Sargent in this way?
It was, as I was so surprised to find that he had done this family of 12 people, I think London was surprised as well. London and New York and Boston, that the leading artist of transatlantic society would choose to paint so many Jews. It wasn't just the Wertheimers. He also painted a number of Sassoons with whom he was very close friends, and Mrs. Karl Mayr and her children, George Lewis, one of the leading solicitors of the time, and his wife and children. All in all, he did about 1,300 portraits, combined oil paintings and charcoal sketches. And of those, about 70 sitters were Jewish, which is about 5%. But in fact, he did several of them more than once. So the percentage is even smaller than 5%. But that, again, as I said, that he would choose to do this, and he clearly became friends with many of these people, it was definitely noted and notable in British society. Some people said he just did it for the money, but by the time he took on the Wertheimer portraits, and the Sassoons were even later, he had more work than he wanted. He was trying to stop painting so much. He wanted to get out of the studio, be free to travel, to do landscapes, and by 1907, he stopped altogether. We'll come back to doing oil portraits. The sittings were sort of torture for him after a while, because they so chained him to his studios. The painter of Jews line, no one actually said that except for critics more recently, but his portrait of Lady Sassoon, who was born Aline de Rothschild in Paris, he did her portrait, and it was shown at the Royal Academy in 1907. And one visitor to the Academy who knew Sargent said to his companion, "Sargent paints nothing but Jews and Jewesses now, and says he prefers them as they have so much more life and movement than our British women." And I think you see that in that portrait of Ina and Betty. Maybe we should go back to this.
Yeah. Let's have a look at this amazing portrait.
So much more life and movement. And he did a number of portraits of sisters. He loved beautiful women, and he loved fabrics and clothing. And there was a wonderful show on Sargent and fashion that was at the Tate a few years ago, and also at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And you, Cordula, are an expert on fashion costumes, so maybe you should talk a little bit about this. Sorry?
I'm not specifically on this period. It's wonderful as you describe this connection between the arms. So we are guided in by this bravura piece of this foreshortened fan. Mm-hmm. Then there is this connection of Ina's hand around Betty's waist, and then Betty's hand is pressing against the oyster silk evening dress of Ina, while Ina in turn is then placing her hand on this wonderful Chinese vase, which I presume is Chinese, really, which is an object almost symbolic of where the family's fortunes were made, namely in the art market. And Sargent is known for this material seductiveness in fabrics and skin, but this portrait is wonderful because they are just stepping out, as it's suggested here, almost into the room or into an event. So there's this suggestion of movement, which we also see in the very broad, loose brushstroke of Ina's skirt, the hem of her skirt, which flickers in movement. It's and they look incredibly happy and engaged. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So I was going to contrast them a little bit with the other sisters, Sargent, and usually there are three, and usually they're seated in a middle distance. They're absolutely gorgeous. There's no criticism to be made of those pictures. The Wyndham Sisters is one of the great paintings of his and of all time at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But there's a more of a distance. They're halfway back in the room, whereas Ina and Betty are practically up at the picture plane. As you say, they look as if they're about to step out into the night, into their lives, into our lives even. So that when that quote says they have more life and movement than our English women, I think this is Exhibit A.
Also that Ina's eyebrows are raised, as if she's saying, "What you mentioned something." There's this emphasis on dialogue, communication. You are drawn into a psychological connectivity with these very, very lively sitters.
Indeed. And I think you see that in the painting of Asher as well. His eyes, I don't know whether you want to go to that right now.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of praise of this portrait at the time, and also a lot of criticism, which I'll quote in a minute. But it's been an extremely controversial painting, a Rorschach test, really, for almost 100 years. His eyes can be read as shrewd and calculating and sort of Shylockian, or as amused, and he and Sargent have a real communication going on, and they're having a good time. There was an American who was also being painted at the same time. As you see, he has a cigar in his left hand, and his right hand is sort of hooked into the pocket of his coat or his waistcoat. And this man saw this. Oh, and also down here in the lower left, next to him is his poodle called Noble, with his tongue hanging out. So
very unusual.
Very unusual. The art historian Trevor Fairbrother says this is the happiest dog in all of Sargent, and that it's nothing if not a felicitous sign. But this visitor who was also being painted at the same time, Ian Phelps Stokes, said of this that Asher looked as if he's pleasantly engaged in counting golden shekels. And Asher left 8 of the paintings to the National Gallery. He kept them, and he and his wife had them during their lifetimes, but they went to the National Gallery after they had both died in 1923. They were all shown together in one room in the National Gallery, and there was a debate about them in Parliament. And one of the members of Parliament, the member from Oxford, who was a historian actually at Oxford, said to the chairman of the committee, "Can't you manage it so that we don't have to have these repulsive pictures on our walls for all time next to the beautiful examples of the work of Turner?" So, and for 100 years, that has, I mean, the debates about these paintings and this one in particular have ranged as widely as that.
For me, it also sort of is a bit formulaic. It goes right back to Titian's state portrait, which he formulated in the early 16th century, where you have a 3/4 or full-length sitter with the hunting dog, very representative of royalty and or imperial authority. And here we have the art dealer with his poodle rather than his hunting dog. And I think also the cigar is indicates leisure. Yeah. When do you smoke a cigar? You smoke a cigar after dinner, when you converse with your friends, and and that you have the poodle almost with his tongue sticking out closest to the picture surface is perhaps also a little joke,
Yes.
Yeah, and that his ethnicity, as many as you write in your book, can't be denied, is perhaps also unashamedly, unapologetically, a man proud of his race. It's a very personal document, isn't it, of a very personal friendship.
Yes, I think so. And as you mentioned about the Titian, portraits have traditionally been the province of royalty and nobility and the church and the military. To have a family, a large family of Jews presented in the National Gallery alongside those other portraits was somewhat shocking. Um,
Mm.
I think Asher knew a great deal about art history. I think this is part of what he had in mind. And I think he was quite self-confident about his ethnicity, and some of his friends objected to this portrayal as being anti-Semitic. I think I don't have a statement that he made about it, but he did go on to commission 10 more. And I think he thought, this is what I look like. This is who I am. I do have a photograph of him there. So
Mm.
we see what he looked like. It's not exactly what Sargent did with it, but
Yeah, yeah. It's um, perhaps we can, for the audience, map out the larger cultural context, because the Wertheimers were part of a great number of Jewish families that rose to fame and fortune in the second half of the 19th century. And indeed, several characters in novels, such as, for instance, the Jewish banker, Mr. Bregert, in Anthony Trollope's 1875 novel, The Way We Live, or Mr. Rosedale in Edith Wharton's 1905 novel, House of Mirth, are wealthy Jewish individuals who successfully play the game of speculative capitalism, but are in the liminal zone of wealthy upper class society. They are, they're part of it, but not inside it. Could you tell us a bit more about the social mobility and the economic cultural factors that fueled it? Perhaps how can we best understand the Wertheimer family in this social grouping and this specific dynamic?
yes, it's a large question, and we probably don't have enough time to go into it in great
Just very
detail.
briefly.
Yeah, but there were, I mean, certainly Asher was an art dealer, not a banker. Many of the most successful, like the Rothschilds, the most successful Jewish families were bankers, not only in England, but certainly there. And they definitely lived the way old line aristocrats had, with country estates and gardens and horse racing, and that was all viewed with somewhat of a skeptical, even hostile stance, even though the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, had what was called a Jew's court. He had several Rothschilds and a Sassoon and several others in his intimate circle, partly because he was very extravagant, unlike his mother, and needed money all the time, and he could readily borrow from these wealthy Jews. So the theme was still money, which was not necessarily the best thing. Asher was, as we know, in an art make. He made his substantial fortune in dealing art, and that moment of cultural history, in that moment, art plays a very crucial role, because the British aristocracy over the last third of the 19th century was in rather dramatic decline in terms of power, status, and certainly income, while the rising new money people on both sides of the Atlantic were, Bernard Berenson said America was minting what he called squillionaires. And the old families did not want to sell their grand houses and land. They might sell their daughters to a rich American who would trade her fortune for a title, or her mother would want her to, such as Consuelo Vanderbilt and the Duke of Marlborough. But they could sell art, which was portable and was increasingly valuable in this time when the newly wealthy people wanted to acquire what had belonged to the old aristocracy. And it was a very risky marketplace. They were just beginning to be real connoisseurship and real standards for authentication. So an honest art dealer, played a very important role in these transactions. And the Wertheimers set themselves up right at that pivot point between the old families wanting to sell and the new families wanting to buy. And certainly a Rembrandt that had been in possession of a British family for 200 years was had a pretty good guarantee of being the real thing. And that was absolutely what collectors such as Morgan and Frick wanted. So, and the Wertheimers were buying those and providing them. Also, French decorative arts were 18th century French decorative arts, absolutely a signature style for the Rothschilds. So I'm wandering around a bit, but it was that the social changes of that period are very much reflected in these lives.
Yeah, and fascinating, as you say, that the rise of a new kind of art dealer, which is tied to increased connoisseurship, a more thorough, approach to originality, authenticity, and this key cultural moment. In your book, you give this wonderful quote by the French writer Edmond de Goncourt in 1877, who writes, "I'm greatly astonished, by the revolution that has suddenly been worked in the habits of the new generation of bric-a-brac dealers. Yesterday they were scrapmongers, and today they are gentlemen dressed by our tailors who buy and read books and have wives as distinguished as the wives in our own circles," and so on. And he says, especially the art trade, takes a specific role in this cultural shift. So, and the Wertheimers were really at this moment. Could we perhaps also look at the next generation? I'm just mindful of time, given that Ina and these wonderful portraits of Ina, she also became an art dealer in her own right. And she's quite an amazing personality.
She is.
Could you tell us a bit more about her? There we have this wonderful portrait, Avec le Gonfier, which means sort of in full sail.
Indeed.
Very unusual. Could you just tell us a bit more about how this portrait came to be?
Yes. So the first one that we looked at, which was with Betty and in a very, very low cut revealing gown, was in 1901. 4 years later, Sargent did this one of her. She came into his studio for the sitting. She was always late, and she had her cloak and her scarf were flying out behind her, and he decided he wanted to paint her that way, in full sail, as you say, avec le gonfier. And so at the time that she was beginning to sit for him, he was also painting the Marlborough family, the 9th Duke of Marlborough and his American wife, Consuelo Vanderbilt, who was very, very wealthy, and the Marlboroughs definitely were losing altitude. And so the Duke, they posed initially for this painting at Blenheim Palace, and it was to go opposite, I believe, a Reynolds portrait of an earlier Duke of Marlborough and his family. But Sargent was finishing it up in his studio. So the Duke would come to the studio for further sittings and this is what he's wearing, his garter, his robes. He was a member of the Most Royal Order of the Garter, which is the highest echelon of chivalry in the British system. There are only 24 people at a time appointed by the sovereign, and almost no women. I mean, Edward VII appointed his wife Alexandra a lady of the Garter, but almost all the others were men. So the robes were in Sargent's studio in between the Duke's sittings, and he either dressed Ina up in the Duke's actual robe or fashioned some very, very close approximation of that robe to dress her up in. And the hat with ostrich feathers was the Garter hat. And so from having been half nude in the portrait with Betty, she's now fully cloaked in masculine black, although actually the Garter robes were a very deep blue velvet. But she's smashing. She's laughing. She's looking over her shoulder. They're clearly having a great deal of fun, which I think is a theme in many of these portraits. Behind her right here, you can see a broomstick that he asked her to hold to poof out the cloak to imitate the motion that he'd seen when she swept into his studio in full sail. So she looks ravishing, fully alive, having a lot of fun. And and I think that, and it's a very transgressive portrait. I mean, she's dressed like a man, though she makes the feathers look sexy, and the cloak, indeed, you sort of want to take it off her and see what she's wearing underneath. So compared to this stony portrait, it's all the difference in the world. They look frozen. There's no expression in the faces. Maybe the younger son, whom we can't really see, and one of the Blenheim spaniels looks like he might be having a little fun. But these faces have no more expression in them than the architectural stone behind them. Consuelo was taller than her husband, so Sargent had her stand on a step to sort of disguise the difference. The marriage was a disaster from the start, and they split up not long after this portrait was painted. But her fortune had indeed saved Blenheim Palace, which was part of the point from the Marlborough side. Both of these paintings appeared in the Royal Academy's exhibition in 1905. And if anyone noticed that the Duke and Ina were wearing the same robe, no one wrote it down, at least not that I was able to find. But I think it does very much portray the contrast, the social contrast that was going on at this time in very vivid terms.
Ina,
she's certainly not Anglican. She's Jewish. She's not a man. She's wealthy, but not compared to the Marlborough family, and then this family. So history is right there.
It's amazing how Ina's portrait subverts, aristocratic insignia of authority by theatricalizing them, and
indeed,
fascinating.
Yeah.
And again, this sort of playfulness and the license to do that in a studio with a friend is, I think, very, very important. So perhaps we can also understand the Wertheimers or Wertheimer's house as almost an intellectual home, for Sargent, where he could get intellectual conversation in a relaxed way. You mentioned also that he brought Monet to the house, and Monet gave a wonderful account of the evening. Could you perhaps say a few words about that memorable event?
Yes, it was Monet and Sargent had become friends in the 1870s and early 80s, and Sargent went to Giverny and painted a portrait of Manet painting. It wasn't a portrait, actually. It was just a picture. And they stayed friends. They spoke French because Manet did not speak English. According to Manet, Sargent rushed up to him at an opening at, I believe, was the Durand-Ruel Gallery, saying, "Is it really you, Claude Monet?" And they stayed close for a long time. And Sargent, right after the Madame X experience, he went to England. He was painting in the Cotswolds, and he did his very famous painting there called Carnation, Lily, Lily, Rose, which is heavily influenced by Impressionism. And Monet would occasionally visit London, and always would see Sargent. They had dined together. They went to art exhibits together. It was a very solid, strong friendship. And in the early I guess when Queen Victoria died, Sargent arranged to bring Monet to a house across the street from Buckingham Palace to watch the funeral procession. And Monet wrote home to his wife a wonderful letter about how interesting it was. And there was an American writer there who was narrating who was there and what was happening. And he said he spoke perfect French. And Sargent says he's the greatest writer in the English language. His name is Henry James. And then Monet was fascinated by London, and especially about the sort of lights at nighttime. And he wanted to find a place from which he could paint these bustling scenes of active London at night. And particularly he wanted to do it at Leicester Square, and he was trying to find a place. And Sargent thought that Asher Wertheimer would be able to help them find such a place. So he took Monet to the Sargents for dinner one night, which was an extraordinary experience. I won't read you that letter because it's rather long, but Monet talked about how wonderful the food was, which for a Frenchman in London, the Wertheimers did have French cooks, and Sargent ate there a lot because he loved good food. The dining room came to be called Sargent's Mess. Monet said the food was great and the young people were extremely interesting, and rien que des juifs, nothing but Jews there, and that the mother and father were very good people, and they did find a studio from which Sargent could paint Leicester Square at night, and he did a series of sketches of that scene.
Yeah. How fascinating that we have this background story to this encounter. Yeah. Shall we look at one more extraordinary portrait of Almenina in
Almina, hold on.
in a sitter in Turkish costume.
Yes,
She's
there she
another
is.
Wertheimer daughter.
Yes.
10 children. It must have been a very bustling house.
It was indeed. It was, and she was one of the younger daughters. And again, as with Ina in Avec les Gonfiers, Sargent is taking liberties. He's playing. There are many allusions in this painting to 18th century aristocratic women dressing up in Turkish costume and being painted by the leading painters of the time. There was a great rage for Turquerie, which you know as an art historian. And it refers a bit to Ingres, the odalisque with Slav. It's all very ambiguous. She's not the odalisque. She's not really the slave. She's wearing a Turkish man's jacket. She's holding an Indian sarod, which she's not even pretending to play. She's holding it in the completely wrong position. Her turban, which is very silky and gauzy, is adorned with jewels. So, and the background is so dim, you can't really see what's going on. But it's the trope, which I did not know about until I was doing this story, of Jews being seen as Oriental, as Eastern, as other. It comes up again and again in the responses to these paintings. And as I say, I had not heard that growing up in America. It's just not something that was discussed. I don't know if it's still a currency or a trope that is used in England. But so here he is. I think this isn't a double play, it's a triple play. He's taking a Jewess, an Oriental woman, dressing her up as a man, referring to art history and all of the rage for Turquerie in 18th century Europe, and just playing, as we said. And so is she a man? Is she a musician? Is she a slave? And at the bottom, you can't really see it there very well, but there's a very ripe melon at her feet, which is a very sexy addition to this picture. It's so male, female, as with Ina and Avec les Gonfiers, Turkish, English, Oriental, musician. He's just putting in everything that seems like fun to him, I think. And
it's clearly a male garment. Yeah,
yes.
she's not dressed as a female.
No.
As a Turkish woman.
No, not at all.
It's fascinating, and you can see again perhaps how different these women were compared to very well brought up aristocratic well-behaved girls who came from more traditional conventional backgrounds, perhaps. Perhaps there was also the attraction to Charles. So Sargent, we have some questions, and I would like to perhaps give now the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. So the first question was, someone would like to know more about Madame X. So why don't we go back and look at this wonderful portrait and have a few comments?
Yes, this painting is now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the Sargent in Paris exhibition, and it will be going to Paris in the fall. So anyone who wants to see it should definitely go see it. Her name was Virginie Gautreau. She was actually an American from New Orleans. She married a French banker and was known as sort of a professional beauty. She was very much a social climber in Paris, quite beautiful. And she wore very bizarre makeup. I mean, in general, but particularly for this painting, she powdered herself in a kind of lavender green powder, and she made her ear, this ear, the other one as well, which we can't see, she used the red powder for that. So it was rather bizarre. One of the jokes about Sargent doing this painting was that he didn't have to. She'd painted herself. It was not a commission. He was very struck by her looks and asked to paint her, thinking that it was finished in 1884. He thought it would be good for his career and draw a lot of attention. It did draw a lot of attention, but not the kind he wanted. He was nervous about it, uncharacteristically. That was not something that he didn't usually exhibit a lot of fear or anxiety ahead of time. He had Oscar Wilde come to his Paris studio they were friends, to look at it, and others showed it to other people too. And when it went up at the Salon, it really elicited a lot of shock. And for one thing, this strap, the shoulder strap, was slipping off her shoulder in the original. It has since been moved up. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the nudity was not something that would shock Paris. Manet's Olympia had been shown with a different kind of scandal many years before. But I think it was that she was American. It's a fascinating portrait. It's rather cold. Her pose is arrogant, and the the torque in her arm there are a lot of things about this that are not at all conventional beauty. So he was American, she was American at a time when Paris was, I'm not a French historian, but I think there was a lot of sense of, as in England, of new people coming in and replacing the social world and the artistic culture that belonged to France. So people just, were horrified and said lots of horrible things about this. A number of Sargent's friends, of artists and even critics, thought it was a brilliant painting, but most people did not. And the day after the opening, her mother and she showed up at his studio in tears and asked him to take it down. And he said that the Academy wouldn't do that. The Salon did not do that. After the show closed, he took it back to his studio. I have another picture, but it's not in this slideshow, of it in his studio. And he kept it there for another 40 years practically. And he did repaint the strap so that it moved up to the proper position and showed it to people when they came to his studio. In 1916, he wrote to the Metropolitan Museum asking if they would like to buy it. And I can't remember the sum, but it wasn't huge. And he said to the curator at the Met, he said, "I think it's the best thing I've done." And it is an extraordinary
It is, yes. Yeah.
And it still has a lot of force, of power.
Absolutely. And it's quite, it's quite different from the glamorous, very sensual society portraits he paints later, which I think also marred his 20th century reputation a bit. If we think of, Greenberg's rather critical comments. How do you think, Sargent's reputation is perhaps interwoven with the reception of the Wertheimer portraits, or do we have to divide that out?
I don't think we have to divide it out, but even during his lifetime, Sargent came in for a lot of criticism from people like Roger Fry, from other artists. He was so successful. That quote from Henry James about the uncanny spectacle of a talent which on its very beginning has nothing more to learn. People thought it was all too easy, that he was too facile, that he was just painting fashionable society portraits when real art by 1910 was going in very different directions. Although by that time Sargent had stopped painting portraits. But I think his phenomenal financial success and popularity was very hard for many other artists, and particularly a critic like Roger Fry, for them to take. And to choose to do portraits that were descended from Velázquez and Frans Hals and from 18th century British portraits when modern art was beginning to be born. I mean, Picasso, Braque, Matisse, that was a little bit later, but it was, and Manet, art was changing. I think Sargent was doing something very interesting. And Elizabeth Pretijean, who couldn't be here, but who is at York, has written a wonderful book called Interpreting Sargent. And she very much makes this point too. I got some of the point from her. He loved visual drama, and I think what captured his attention was this social drama that was going on in his lifetime. So some of his old aristocrats are so attenuated, it looks like they have blood, cold water rather than blood running through their veins, unlike Ina and Betty. And so he was watching this social drama, as we talked about a few minutes ago, about the upper classes losing altitude and the new people, some of them Jewish, not all by any means, on the rise. And he was portraying all of them, as well as a great many other things. But I think he's capturing that social drama. And that was a rather modern thing to do, even though he wasn't a Cubist. He wasn't supporting Braque and Picasso and Matisse. But I think it was another side of modernism. But by the time World War I came along, and then the Depression, and then World War II, painting fashionable people in high society was just not what the world wanted to see. So Sargent's reputation really crashed and did not recover until the 1990s, really. There were almost no exhibitions of his work on either side of the Atlantic for most of the 20th century after his death in 1925. And Hilton Kramer wrote a wonderful column in New York in the 1990s saying, it's time to forgive Sargent for making it big in the 1880s. And now, I mean, the world can't seem to get enough of Sargent. It's just nonstop, but it was definitely stopped for decades.
Yeah, we are still, I think, in the aftermath of the big rediscovery of Sargent in the 1990s. And I just, in conclusion, wanted to point out to the audience that there's a wonderful exhibition at Kenwood House in London, Heiresses of Sargent's Heiresses, which is on at Kenwood House until the 5th of October. And Jean, you already mentioned the wonderful exhibition Sargent and Paris at the Metropolitan Museum until the 3rd of August, which will travel then to Musée d'Orsay, and will be there until the 11th of January 2026. So certainly many wonderful opportunities, perhaps for audiences to see paintings firsthand, but otherwise visit the Tate closer home. And well, we are close to 9 o'clock now, and I just wanted to take the opportunity, really, Jean, thank you so much for joining us to share so many fascinating stories. And it's a very thought-provoking topic. So thank you as well for answering questions, especially about Madame X. And for the audience, thank you very much for attending today's event. Be sure to check out what else is coming up in the festival program. And as the chat channel here has already mentioned, the recording of this event will be available on the festival's YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival. And you will be contacted by email when the video is available. So for now, thank you so much, Jean. We salute your excellent research, forensic detective, wonderful. And it's a wonderfully readable book. Yeah, thank you so much for giving us that treasure. And we say goodbye to New York now from Old York
Right.
to New York.
Thank you
so very
much.
much the topic of today. Thank you again, Jean.
Thank you so much.